15. Forgotten instant meals. Ancient Chinese merchants ate on the Silk Road. When we imagine the Silk Road, we often picture caravans of camels stretching across endless deserts, traders wrapped in thick robes, wind carving patterns into golden sand, and goods like silk, jade, and spices moving between empires. But here's something we rarely think about. What did those merchants actually eat? They weren't traveling for a few hours, they were traveling for months, sometimes years, crossing brutal terrain from Chang'an, the capital of the Tang dynasty, all the way toward Central Asia, Persia, and even lands connected to the Roman Empire. There were no restaurants in the desert, no inns every few miles, no refrigeration, no modern cooking tools. And yet, they survived. Not just survived, they thrived, because they carried something incredibly smart: instant food. Not the kind you pour hot water into like modern noodles, but compact, preserved, travel-ready meals designed for speed, durability, and energy. Today we're diving into 15 forgotten instant meals that powered Chinese merchants across the Silk Road. And the first one might surprise you. Pirmei's Hu Bing, the portable flatbread of survival. If you were a merchant leaving Chang'an, one of the first things packed into your caravan would be something called Hu Bing. Hu Bing was a type of baked flatbread, dense, slightly chewy, designed to last. Unlike soft steam buns that spoil quickly, Hu Bing was baked until firm and dry. That meant it could survive weeks, sometimes months, without going bad. The name itself tells a story. Hu referred to Western or Central Asian influences. This bread wasn't purely Chinese. It was cultural fusion, a product of exchange. Imagine this. Before even reaching the Western deserts, Chinese traders were already eating food influenced by foreign lands. Hu Bing was often made with wheat flour, which became increasingly common in northern China. It could be eaten dry, dipped in water, or softened in broth if available. No preparation needed. Just break and eat. In a sandstorm, in freezing mountain passes, on the move. It didn't matter. Hu Bing was survival in bread form. 2. Dried noodles. The ancient version of instant ramen. Long before packaged instant ramen existed, Chinese merchants carried dried noodles. Noodles had been around in China for thousands of years, and by the time of the Tang dynasty, wheat noodles were widely consumed in northern regions. Merchants would dry them completely before travel. Without moisture, they wouldn't spoil easily. When reaching an oasis or caravanserai with access to boiling water, they could cook quickly. If no cooking was possible, they sometimes soaked them in cold water to soften. Crude? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. Think about how revolutionary that was. Portable carbohydrates, lightweight, high energy, easy to cook, shareable. Noodles were not just food, they were a technology. Chao Rugan. Ancient dried meat strips. Travel requires protein, and ancient merchants had their own version of jerky, rugan. Thin strips of salted, spiced, and air-dried meat was essential. Beef and mutton were most common, especially as traders moved westward into regions where sheep were abundant. The meat was sliced thin, heavily salted, sometimes brushed with honey or fermented sauces, then dried under the sun. This did two things: removed moisture, prevented bacterial growth. The result? Portable protein that could last weeks. Merchants would chew it slowly while riding camels across desert stretches like those near Dunhuang. High salt content also helped retain electrolytes crucial in hot climates. They didn't know modern nutritional science, but through experience they learned what worked. 4 to roasted millet cakes. Before rice dominated southern China, millet was king in the north. Millet grows well in dry climates, perfect for regions connected to the Silk Road. Merchants often carried roasted millet pressed into small cakes or balls. These were compact, hard, almost rock-like. But once soaked or chewed slowly, they provided sustained energy. Millet is rich in fiber and minerals. It digests slowly, preventing energy crashes. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of an energy bar. Simple ingredients. Maximum durability. 5. Tea bricks. Drink and soup base in one. Now here's something fascinating. Merchants didn't just carry loose tea leaves. They carried compressed tea bricks. Tea leaves were steamed and pressed into dense blocks. These were easy to transport and less fragile. But tea bricks weren't only for drinking. They could be scraped into boiling water for tea, crumbled into soup, used as trade currency. Yes, in some regions, tea bricks were literally money. In cold mountain passes near areas like the Tian Shan Range, hot tea wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Tea helped with digestion, warmth, morale. And morale matters when you're months away from home. 6. Fermented soybean paste cakes. Fermentation was one of ancient China's greatest food innovations. Merchants carried dried cakes of fermented soybean paste, early forms of what would evolve into miso-like and Dubin-style products. These paste cakes were intensely salty. On their own, not very pleasant. But mixed into hot water, instant soup. Spread on bread, flavor boost. Added to noodles, protein and depth. Fermentation also preserved nutrients and introduced beneficial bacteria. Without refrigeration, fermentation was genius. Sought sesame sugar clusters. Not all food was purely survival-focused. Some foods boosted morale. Sesame seeds mixed with hardened sugar or honey formed crunchy clusters. These were high-calorie snacks. Sugar was rare and valuable, so these were not everyday snacks, but special energy reserves. Sesame seeds are rich in healthy fats and minerals. Compact, calorie-dense, long-lasting, perfect caravan fuel. 8. Pickled vegetables in sealed jars. Fresh vegetables spoil fast. Pickled vegetables do not. Cabbage, radish, mustard greens, all preserved in salt brine or vinegar. While jars were heavy, caravans often traveled in large groups. Shared supplies made weight manageable. Pickles prevented vitamin deficiencies. They also added flavor to otherwise bland, dry meals. Salted, sour, crunchy. A psychological reminder of home. 9. Hard rice balls, early travel fantuan. Rice dominated southern China, but traders from those regions adapted rice for travel. Cooked rice was compressed tightly into balls, sometimes salted heavily, then dried slightly. Not as durable as wheat bread, but still portable for shorter legs of the journey. Some were wrapped in leaves for protection. Rice balls were often eaten early in the journey before spoilage risk increased. Fast, familiar, comforting. 10. Roasted chickpeas and broad beans. As merchants moved westward, legumes became common trade goods and food sources. Chickpeas and broad beans could be roasted until hard and crunchy. No cooking required. High in protein, high in fiber, long shelf life. In many ways, they resemble modern trail mix components. These legumes were also easily traded or exchanged along the route. Food and commodity in one. Now here's the powerful truth. The Silk Road wasn't just about silk. It was about knowledge. Food preservation techniques traveled alongside textiles and spices. Some of the instant-style foods merchants carried influenced cuisines far beyond China. By the time a merchant caravan moved beyond the Hexi corridor and approached the harsh gateways of the western regions, food became more than comfort. It became strategy. Every item had to justify its weight. Every ingredient had to survive heat, cold, sand, and time. And this is where the Silk Road truly shows its genius. Because many of the instant meals merchants relied on were not purely Chinese anymore. They were hybrid foods, frontier foods, survival foods born from cultural exchange. Let's continue. Shi, Nai Lao Gan, dried milk curd cakes. As Chinese merchants pushed westward toward Central Asia, they encountered pastoral cultures who depended heavily on livestock. One of the most powerful travel foods they adopted was dried milk curd, sometimes referred to as Nai Lao Gan. Milk was fermented, curdled, pressed, and then dried into hard chunks. Once completely dehydrated, these curds could last for months. They were extremely dense in calories, rich in protein and fat, lightweight compared to fresh dairy. To eat them, merchants could chew them slowly like hard candy, soften them in hot water, crush them into soups. In freezing high-altitude passes near mountain routes leading toward Central Asia, these dairy curds provided much-needed fat, something grain-based diets often lacked. It's fascinating because traditional Chinese cuisine historically used less dairy, but the Silk Road changed that. Trade didn't just move silk. It moved taste. 12. Barley flour mix. The proto-instant porridge. Barley was widely consumed in Central Asia and gradually became familiar to Chinese traders. One practical solution for travel was roasted barley flour. The grain was roasted first, which enhanced flavor and improved shelf life. Then ground into flour. This flour could be mixed instantly with hot water, stirred with cold water if necessary, combined with tea or milk. In some regions, a similar concept exists today, like Tibetan Sampa. Merchants could carry a pouch of roasted barley flour and prepare food in minutes. No long cooking required, just water. In environments where fuel was scarce, that mattered. Firewood in desert regions was not always easy to find. Quick food preparation saved both time and resources. 13i, powdered bone broth cakes. This one is often overlooked. Animal bones were simmered for long periods to extract nutrients. The broth was then reduced until thick and gelatinous. When cooled and dried, it formed hard, concentrated cakes. Think about that for a moment. Portable broth. These cakes could be dropped into boiling water to create instant soup. High in minerals, deep in flavor, easy to transport. Merchants understood something important. Warm liquid meals boost morale and restore strength. After a long day riding through dust and wind, a simple cup of hot broth could feel like a feast. This was not luxury. It was psychological survival. 14 walnut and date paste rolls. As caravans passed through oasis towns, dried fruits became increasingly common. Walnuts, dates, and sometimes honey were mashed together into dense rolls or blocks. These were compact energy bombs, high in natural sugars and healthy fats. No cooking required. They didn't spoil easily if kept dry. In the middle of a desert crossing, when energy dipped and exhaustion crept in, these rolls were quick solutions. Chew, swallow, keep moving. Modern energy bars follow the same principle. But these ancient versions were simpler, and perhaps even more powerful. 15th emergency famine cakes, the last resort rations. Now we come to something far less glamorous. Not every instant meal was delicious. Some were purely emergency survival tools. Merchants often carried compressed grain and bran cakes, sometimes mixed with wild edible plants. These were incredibly dry, dense, hard to swallow without water, but they could prevent starvation during unexpected delays. If a sandstorm blocked the path, if bandits forced a detour, if an oasis had dried up. These cakes were eaten sparingly. They were not everyday food. They were insurance. It tells us something important about Silk Road merchants. They planned for disaster. They understood risk. They respected the land. Now step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. These 15 instant meals reveal something profound. Ancient Chinese merchants were not simply traders. They were logisticians, nutrition strategists, adaptation experts. They blended Chinese agricultural knowledge, Central Asian pastoral techniques, preservation science, practical survival wisdom. The Silk Road was not just a road, it was a moving civilization. Every bite they took carried stories of exchange. Every preserved grain, every dried curd, every compressed brick of tea represented centuries of experimentation. And here's the fascinating part. Many modern convenience foods, instant noodles, protein bars, bouillon cubes, jerky, follow the exact same survival principles those merchants relied on over 1,000 years ago. Lightweight, long shelf life, high energy, minimal preparation. We call it modern innovation. But the blueprint was written in deserts, mountains, and caravan trails long before factories existed. And maybe that's the biggest forgotten truth of all. The ancient world was far more practical, far more resourceful, and far more innovative than we often imagine. To truly understand why these foods existed, you have to understand where they were eaten. A merchant didn't simply leave Chang'an and arrive weeks later in some distant Western kingdom. The journey unfolded in stages. From the fertile Wei River Valley, caravans moved through the narrow Hexi corridor, a long stretch of land bordered by mountains and desert. It was both a lifeline and a bottleneck. Beyond that lay Dunhuang. Dunhuang was not just a stop, it was a psychological checkpoint. The final stronghold before entering the vast, unforgiving deserts of the Tarim Basin. Once a caravan passed Dunhuang, mistakes became deadly. Food planning changed at this point. Inside the city, merchants could still find fresh bread, cooked noodles, vegetables, meat stews. Outside, everything had to survive on its own. That is why the instant meals we've discussed were not optional. They were calculated. Caravans, leaving Dunhuang, often reorganized supplies. Water skins were checked. Grain sacks were inspected. Dried meats were counted. Because beyond that point lay desert routes leading toward oasis cities like Khotan and Kashgar, places separated by hundreds of kilometers of sand. And sand consumes weakness. Oasis economics and food storage. Oasis cities were not random rest stops. They were economic hubs. Places like Khotan became famous for jade. Kashgar became a crossroads of culture. When merchants arrived at these cities, they replenished supplies. But they didn't rely entirely on local markets. Many oasis settlements maintained caravan warehouses. Archaeological findings from Silk Road regions show storage rooms filled with grain sacks, dried fruit, tea bricks, fermented pastes. Food wasn't just purchased casually, it was prearranged. Sometimes caravans would send messages ahead to ensure supplies were ready. Think about how advanced that coordination was. Without telephones, without modern logistics software. Food-shaped timing. A caravan might wait weeks in an oasis if supplies were low, or if extreme weather made travel dangerous. Which means those instant meals were not only emergency rations, they were negotiation tools. If local food was scarce, merchants relied on their preserved reserves. If local food was abundant, they traded surplus instant rations for other goods. Even food itself became trade currency. Tea bricks especially were powerful. In some Western regions, tea was more valuable than silver. Fuel scarcity and cooking innovation. Here's something most people overlook. Cooking requires fuel, and fuel was not always available. In forested regions, wood was abundant. In desert zones, almost non-existent. So merchants adapted. Many of their instant meals required minimal heating. Roasted barley flour could be eaten cold. Dried curds could be softened with limited hot water. Jerky required no cooking. Compressed broth cakes required only brief boiling. This efficiency was intentional. Firewood might be carried in small bundles, but often caravans relied on dried animal dung as fuel, particularly in steppe regions. Cooking time had to be short. Long, simmering stews were rare once deep into desert territory. Efficiency became culinary philosophy, psychological survival, and familiar taste. Traveling months away from home changes a person. The Silk Road was dangerous. Bandits existed. Political borders shifted. Weather turned without warning. Food became emotional stability. A bite of familiar flatbread. The smell of tea. The saltiness of fermented soybean paste. These weren't just flavors. They were memory anchors. A merchant from the Tang heartland, tasting millet cakes in the middle of a foreign landscape, felt a connection to home. That emotional strength mattered. Caravans were communities. They shared meals. They told stories while chewing dried meat under starlit skies. Instant meals made that possible. Without preserved food, shared eating moments would have been rare luxuries. Instead, they became nightly rituals, cultural exchange through food. Now here's where it gets truly fascinating. Food didn't just travel west. It traveled east. Chinese merchants adopted dairy preservation techniques from Central Asian nomads. In return, Chinese fermentation techniques influenced regions further west. Spices moved. Grains moved. Methods moved. Over centuries, these exchanges shaped cuisines from China to Persia. Some historians believe that certain noodle traditions may have influenced or interacted with pasta traditions further west, though debates continue. What's undeniable is this. The Silk Road was not a one-way flow of silk. It was a multi-directional exchange of survival knowledge, and food preservation was one of the most powerful technologies shared: risk, rationing, and leadership. Inside a caravan, ration control was serious business. Caravan leaders calculated distances between oases. They monitored water usage. They enforced ration discipline. If someone consumed too much dried grain early in the journey, it endangered everyone later. Food distribution reflected hierarchy. Wealthier merchants carried better supplies. More dried fruits, more meat, more tea. Hired guards and camel drivers often ate simpler rations. But during emergencies, survival leveled status. Everyone depended on preserved reserves. In extreme cases, rationing became strict. Meals shrank. Salt intake increased to preserve water retention. Travel slowed to conserve energy. These were not casual journeys. They were calculated survival operations. Archaeological evidence of Silk Road diets. Excavations in Silk Road regions have revealed fascinating details. Fragments of ancient noodles have been discovered in northwestern China, preserved by arid conditions. Dried fruit pits and nutshells have been uncovered in caravan settlements. Residues inside pottery show evidence of fermented products. Even tea traces have been identified in western frontier sites. These findings confirm what historical records suggest. Merchants relied heavily on preserved, portable, high-calorie foods. Fresh food was temporary. Preserved food was reliable. Now pause for a moment. Imagine yourself in that caravan, weeks away from home. Sand stretching endlessly. Cold nights, hot days. You reach into a pouch and pull out roasted barley flour. Mix it with a little water. Swallow. Not glamorous, not luxurious, but sustaining. And sustaining meant survival. Those 15 forgotten instant meals were not just convenient. They were the reason global trade could exist at that scale. Without portable food, the Silk Road would have collapsed under its own logistical weight. Food made globalization possible, long before the modern world. By now, we've explored what merchants ate and how those foods kept them alive. But food is never just about survival. Food reveals hierarchy, belief, wealth, identity. And on the Silk Road, those differences became very clear. Elite merchants versus caravan workers. Not every traveler on the Silk Road ate the same way. A wealthy merchant leaving Chang'an during the height of the Tang dynasty might travel with personal attendants, guards, account keepers, experienced caravan masters, and his food supplies reflected that status. While common camel drivers relied heavily on roasted grains, dried legumes, and simple jerky, elite merchants often carried higher quality dried meats, better fermented sauces, larger quantities of tea, honeyed fruit preserves, fine wheat flatbreads instead of coarse millet cakes. Some even traveled with small portable cooking vessels reserved only for their meals. But here's the interesting part. Once deep in desert territory, privilege shrank. Extreme conditions made everyone dependent on preserved rations. In sandstorms or supply shortages, social boundaries blurred. A wealthy trader chewing the same dry barley mix as a hired guard. That was the equalizer of the Silk Road. Religious dietary influence. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was a religious corridor. Buddhism moved from India into China along these paths. Islam later spread eastward through Central Asia. Nestorian Christianity also appeared in parts of Tang China. Each belief system influenced food practices. Buddhist merchants often avoided meat when possible. That meant they relied more heavily on dried legumes, roasted grains, sesame clusters, fermented soybean products. Vegetarian-friendly instant foods were practical for them. In contrast, merchants from Central Asian regions where Islam was growing avoided pork and focused on mutton jerky, dairy curds, barley flour, food preservation techniques adapted to belief. That's something rarely discussed. Religion didn't just shape temples and texts. It shaped what fit inside travel sacks, seasonal travel diets. Timing was everything. Most caravans avoided the harshest summer desert heat and the dead of winter in high mountain passes. Spring and autumn were preferred. But seasonal travel meant seasonal food adjustments. In colder months, higher fat foods were prioritized. Dairy curds were packed in larger quantities. Bone broth cakes were valued more. In hotter months, salt-heavy foods were rationed carefully. Pickled vegetables were crucial to prevent nutrient deficiencies. Water retention strategies shaped diet. Imagine crossing regions near the Taklamakan Desert in peak summer. The sun would drain you quickly. Too much salted jerky without enough water could be dangerous. So ration planning had to consider climate. Food was never random. It was strategic. Caravanserais, the Silk Road rest stations. As trade expanded, infrastructure improved. Caravanserais, roadside inns built along major routes, became vital. Though the concept flourished more prominently westward in Persian territories, similar stopping complexes existed along eastern stretches too. At these rest stations, merchants could sometimes cook more elaborate meals using their preserved ingredients. Dried noodles became proper soups. Barley flour turned into thick porridge. Fermented paste mixed with local herbs created richer flavors. Instant foods transformed into temporary feasts. These stops were also places of exchange. A Chinese merchant might taste spiced lamb stew from a Persian traveler. A Central Asian trader might sample fermented soybean paste for the first time. Food curiosity grew alongside commerce. The evolution of taste. One of the most fascinating outcomes of the Silk Road was culinary evolution. Consider this. Northern Chinese cuisine today uses wheat-based foods extensively. Noodles, dumplings, flatbreads. Central Asian regions developed strong traditions of roasted meats and dairy preservation. Spice routes introduced ingredients like cumin more widely into Chinese frontier cooking. While historians debate exact origins of specific dishes, what's undeniable is that frontier regions became culinary laboratories. The foods merchants carried for survival slowly influenced regional cuisines. Some preservation techniques remained. Some evolved into refined dishes. What began as survival rations eventually became tradition. Emergency scenarios. When instant meals meant life or death, not every journey went smoothly. Historical accounts describe caravans caught in sudden sandstorms, routes disappearing overnight, oases drying up due to shifting water sources. In those moments, emergency famine cakes and concentrated rations were life-saving. Rationing became strict. Meals reduced to minimal portions. Sometimes caravans survived purely on roasted grain flour mixed with small amounts of water for days. Think about the mental strength required to wake up, eat a handful of dry flour paste, and continue walking across endless terrain. Those instant meals weren't glamorous. They were survival mathematics. Calories divided by distance. Water divided by days remaining. Why these foods were forgotten. So why don't we hear about these Silk Road instant meals today? Because history often focuses on luxury goods. Silk, spices, gold, jade. The glamorous side of trade overshadows the practical side. But without food preservation, none of that trade would have been possible. Instant meals were the invisible infrastructure of globalization. They didn't sparkle, they sustained, and sustaining is what builds history. The bigger realization. When we look at modern instant noodles, protein bars, dried fruit packets, and bouillon cubes, we think of convenience. But for Silk Road merchants, convenience meant survival. Every preserved flatbread, every dried curd, every compressed tea brick was a calculated response to geography. The deserts of Western China, the mountains of Central Asia, the unpredictable politics between empires. Food was strategy. Food was technology. Food was insurance. And here's something powerful to consider. The Silk Road connected worlds long before modern globalization. But it was carried on the backs of camels and inside cloth sacks filled with dried grains, meats, and fermented pastes. Not glamorous, not luxurious, but revolutionary. By now, one thing should be clear. The Silk Road did not run on silk. It ran on calories. Behind every bolt of fabric that left Chang'an during the height of the Tang Dynasty. Behind every jade carving traded in oasis markets. Behind every diplomatic gift exchanged between distant empires. There was a pouch of dried grain, a brick of tea, a strip of salted meat. History remembers luxury, but survival built history. From merchant food to military rations. As trade networks expanded, governments began to pay attention. Chinese frontier garrisons stationed along Silk Road corridors needed portable food just as merchants did. Soldiers guarding Western territories could not rely on fresh supplies arriving daily. So many of the same principles used by merchants appeared in military provisions. Roasted grains, dried meats, fermented pastes, compressed tea. Military logistics became more efficient because trade routes had already tested these systems. Preserved food allowed armies to move farther without collapsing supply lines. In this way, the instant meals of merchants quietly influenced state power. Food preservation strengthened borders, comparing East and West. While Chinese merchants relied heavily on millet cakes, wheat flatbreads, tea bricks, and soybean fermentation, traders connected to the Roman Empire used their own preserved systems. Roman travelers carried hardtack-style bread, salted pork, dried olives, wine concentrates. Meanwhile, Persian traders transported dried fruits, nuts, yogurt-based preserved dairy, flatbreads similar to those seen across Central Asia. When these systems met along the Silk Road, ideas blended. Preservation methods evolved. Flavor combinations expanded. Cumin and coriander traveled east. Fermentation knowledge moved west. The Silk Road was not a food competition. It was a collaboration. What modern survival experts can learn. Strip away the romance of camel caravans and ancient trade. What remains are powerful survival principles that still apply today. The merchants chose foods that were lightweight, calorie-dense, shelf-stable, quick to prepare, nutritionally balanced enough to prevent collapse. Modern survival kits follow the exact same blueprint. Energy bars mirror walnut date rolls. Jerky mirrors roux gan. Bouillon cubes mirror powdered bone broth cakes. Instant porridge packets mirror roasted barley flour mixes. Even electrolyte drinks reflect the ancient understanding that salt and hydration must be balanced carefully. The technology improved. The principles stayed the same. The human element. Now imagine a night deep in desert territory. The caravan forms a circle. Camels kneel. Winds soften. Small, controlled fire burns using scarce fuel. A merchant breaks apart a tea brick. Another drops a fragment of broth concentrate into boiling water. Someone passes around roasted chickpeas. Another unwraps a millet cake. There is no restaurant, no market stall, no banquet hall, just preserved food, shared quietly under stars. In that moment, those instant meals are more than rations. They are proof of preparation, proof of foresight, proof of resilience. Without them, trade would have stalled, routes would have shortened, empires would have remained isolated. Why these 15 meals matter. Let's remember them clearly. Roux being flatbread, dried noodles, roux gan jerky, roasted millet cakes, tea bricks, fermented soybean paste cakes, sesame sugar clusters, pickled vegetables, hard rice balls, roasted chickpeas and beans, dried milk curds, roasted barley flour mix, powdered bone broth cakes, walnut and date paste rolls, emergency famine cakes. They weren't delicacies. They were systems. Each one solved a logistical problem. Each one extended the reach of civilization. Each one helped merchants survive thousands of kilometers of uncertainty. The bigger historical truth. We often talk about the Silk Road as the first wave of globalization. But globalization does not begin with luxury goods. It begins with sustainability. If a journey cannot feed itself, it cannot continue. Ancient Chinese merchants understood that better than most. They engineered food for endurance. They balanced flavor with function. They prepared for disaster before it arrived. And because they did, ideas, religions, technologies, and cultures traveled across continents. When you look at modern convenience food today, it's easy to dismiss it as simple or ordinary. But its ancestor once crossed deserts. Its ancestor climbed mountains. Its ancestor held together the most important trade network of the ancient world. And that is why these forgotten instant meals deserve to be remembered, not as recipes, but as the quiet engines of history. By this point, we understand something important. These instant meals were not random snacks. They were part of a survival ecosystem that stretched from Chang'an all the way across Central Asia and into lands once connected with the Roman Empire. But what happened after the merchants finished their journeys? Did these foods disappear? Or did they leave fingerprints on the future? The answer is far more interesting than most people realize. From survival rations to cultural cuisine, many foods that began as travel necessities slowly integrated into regional traditions. Take dried noodles. What began as a practical, lightweight food for caravan travel gradually evolved into the complex noodle cultures of northern China. Over centuries, variations expanded. Hand-pulled noodles, knife-cut noodles, stuffed dumplings. But the preservation logic remained. Dry first, store long, cook quickly. The same applies to dried meats. In frontier regions of northwestern China, air-dried and wind-cured meats became staples, not just for travel, but for everyday life. What was once emergency protein became culinary identity. Even compressed tea bricks continued to play economic roles for centuries, particularly in frontier trade with nomadic groups. Tea remained portable, tradable, and culturally powerful. What began as merchant fuel became tradition. The frontier effect. Frontier regions are laboratories of adaptation. Areas near Dunhuang and the western corridors weren't purely Chinese nor purely Central Asian. They were blended zones. Archaeological discoveries from sites in the Tarim Basin show a mixture of food remains: wheat, millet, dairy traces, fruit pits. Evidence of dietary crossover. People living in these regions didn't just eat preserved food occasionally. Preserved food became normal. Harsh climates demanded. And so the line between travel ration and local cuisine blurred. In many ways, frontier cooking was born from caravan survival food. Risk, trust, and shared meals. Food also shaped relationships. Caravans were made up of strangers from different ethnic backgrounds. Trust had to be built. Sharing preserved food was one way to create unity. Offering someone a piece of dried fruit, a handful of roasted beans, or a sip of tea was not just hospitality. It was reassurance. We are allies. We survive together. In uncertain territory, trust mattered as much as supplies. A merchant who refused to share in times of scarcity could damage his reputation permanently. And reputation traveled faster than caravans. Climate engineering through food. Let's talk about adaptation on a deeper level. The Silk Road crossed wildly different climates: freezing mountain passes, scorching desert basins, wind-heavy steppes. Food preservation methods had to respond to all three. Dry desert air was perfect for curing meat. Cold mountain air preserved dairy. Salting techniques changed depending on humidity. Merchants adjusted food packing strategies depending on season and route. They were not just traders. They were climate strategists. Even today, modern outdoor survival guides recommend similar logic. High fat for cold climates. Balanced electrolytes for heat. Lightweight carbs for endurance. Ancient merchants practiced this intuitively. The decline of the traditional caravan. As maritime trade expanded and sea routes grew stronger, the overland Silk Road gradually declined in dominance. Ships could carry far more cargo at lower risk. But something interesting happened. Even as caravans became less central, preserved travel foods did not disappear. Instead, they adapted to new contexts. Maritime voyages required long-lasting provisions. Military campaigns required portable rations. Explorers required shelf-stable calories. The survival food logic, born in desert caravans, simply moved to new vehicles. The method survived, even if the camels didn't. Modern echoes of ancient innovation. Think about how often we rely on instant food today. Busy schedules, travel, emergencies, outdoor adventures, disaster preparedness kits. The blueprint is ancient. Compact grains, dried protein, fermented concentrates, compressed tea or drink bases. The packaging changed, the science advanced, but the principle is identical. And perhaps that's the most powerful realization of all. We are not as different from those merchants as we think. We still value food that is portable, reliable, efficient, comforting. They carried it across deserts. We carry it in backpacks. The logic is the same. A final reflection. Imagine standing at the edge of the desert outside Dunhuang centuries ago. Behind you lies the structured world of the Tang capital. Ahead lies uncertainty. Before taking that first step into open desert, a merchant checks his supplies. Flatbread, packed. Jerky, sealed. Roasted grain flour, secured. Tea brick, wrapped. Emergency cakes, counted. He's not thinking about culinary artistry. He is thinking about distance. He is thinking about survival. He is thinking about returning home. Those 15 forgotten instant meals were quiet companions on that journey. Without them, the Silk Road would have been shorter. Trade would have been slower. Cultural exchange would have been weaker. Sometimes history turns not on empires or wars, but on what people carry in their food sacks. Picture a caravan moving west after leaving Dunhuang, one of the last major strongholds before the open desert routes of the Tarim Basin. The walls of the city fade behind them. Ahead lies open terrain, wind, sand, distance. Now let's break down what a typical day of eating might actually look like. Early morning. Minimal, practical, control. Before sunrise, movement begins. Traveling early avoids extreme daytime heat. Breakfast is not elaborate. It is controlled. A merchant might begin with a small portion of roasted barley flour mixed with warm water if fuel allows, sometimes blended with crushed dried milk curd. This creates a thick paste, simple, dense, sustaining. No heavy cooking. Fuel is conserved. If tea is available, a small scraping from a compressed tea brick is boiled. Tea is not wasted casually. Hydration is strategic. Too much early in the day means carrying less later. Too little means weakness. Balance is everything. Mid-morning, while riding. As camels move steadily across open terrain, merchants eat while traveling. This is where instant foods shine. No stopping required. From cloth pouches come strips of dried meat, roasted chickpeas or broad beans, small chunks of sesame sugar clusters. These foods require no preparation. They can be eaten one-handed. They provide protein and fat. Chewing dried meat also slows water consumption. A subtle but important advantage. Midday, heat management. By midday, desert heat becomes intense. Travel may slow or temporarily pause. This is not the time for heavy meals. Salt-heavy foods like jerky are rationed carefully to avoid dehydration. Instead, lighter options appear. A softened piece of hubing flatbread, pickled vegetables for mineral balance, possibly a small walnut date roll for quick energy. Pickles are particularly important here. The salt helps maintain electrolyte balance, but in controlled amounts. Too much salt without enough water is dangerous. Merchants knew this through experience, even if they didn't use modern terminology. Evening, the only real meal. When the caravan stops for the night, this is when more structured food preparation happens. Fuel is gathered, Dried brush, animal dung, whatever's available. A small fire is made. Now preserved foods transform. Dried noodles may be boiled. Powdered bone broth cakes are dissolved into water. Fermented soybean paste cakes are added for flavor and protein. Suddenly, the meal feels substantial, warm, restorative. Some dairy curds may be softened in hot liquid. Flatbread is dipped into broth. This is the emotional center of the day. Food at night rebuilds morale. Without it, the psychological weight of the journey becomes heavy. Nutritional breakdown. Surprisingly balanced. If we analyze this reconstructed diet carefully, something surprising appears. It's actually well balanced for survival. Carbohydrates, millet cakes, barley flour, flatbread, noodles. Protein, dried meat, legumes, dairy curds, fermented soybean paste. Fats, sesame clusters, dairy, nuts. Minerals, pickled vegetables, bone broth concentrate. Caffeine and mild stimulants, tea. It's not luxurious, but it is functional. Ancient merchants were unknowingly managing macronutrients with impressive accuracy. Too many carbs without protein would cause weakness. Too much protein without grains would strain supplies. Too much salt without water would cause collapse. Balance meant survival. Archaeological evidence of preserved food. Excavations in western China have revealed dried noodle fragments preserved by arid conditions. At desert burial sites in the Tarim Basin, researchers have found traces of wheat-based foods placed with the deceased. In some frontier settlements, remnants of fermented products and grain storage containers have been uncovered. These discoveries confirm something important. Preserved grain foods were common. They were portable. They were valued enough to accompany people even into burial contexts. Food wasn't disposable. It was central to life and identity. Reconstructing a Silk Road ration pack today. If someone today wanted to recreate a historically accurate Silk Road ration kit, it might include dense baked flatbread, air-dried beef or lamb, roasted barley flour in a sealed pouch, dried milk curd chunks, roasted chickpeas, compressed tea, dried fruit and nut rolls, a small fermented paste concentrate. Notice something interesting. Every item on that list could still be made today without advanced technology. No refrigeration required. No synthetic preservatives. Just drying, salting, fermenting, roasting, compressing. Ancient techniques. Still effective. The mental strength behind the meals. But here's what truly stands out. These foods required discipline. You could not overeat early in the journey. You could not waste tea for comfort. You could not indulge in dried fruit recklessly. Portions were measured by distance, not appetite. That mindset shaped the merchant class. They became planners, calculators, risk assessors. Food management mirrored trade management. Both required foresight, the quiet backbone of globalization. When historians describe the Silk Road, they talk about silk reaching Rome, spices entering China, religions spreading across continents. But none of that movement would have been possible if caravans collapsed from starvation halfway through the desert. These 15 forgotten instant meals were not glamorous. They were infrastructure, invisible infrastructure. And invisible systems are often the most important. Once a caravan moved beyond the protective network of cities like Dunhuang, they entered a world where nature held authority. Storms could bury paths overnight. Water sources could shift or dry up. Bandit attacks could scatter supplies. Food shortages were not hypothetical. They were expected risks. When rations ran low, caravan leaders constantly calculated distance between oasis points, such as Khotan or Kashgar. If a journey between two stops took longer than expected, Rationing began immediately. First adjustment: reduce portion sizes. Barley flour portions were cut in half. Dried meat distributed only once per day instead of twice. Tea scraping became thinner. Second adjustment: shift to emergency famine cakes. These dense, unpleasant grain blocks were designed for exactly this moment. They were hard to swallow and required water, but they slowed starvation. They were survival insurance. And once they appeared in daily rotation, everyone in the caravan knew the situation was serious. The psychology of scarcity, hunger, changes behavior. Even disciplined merchants felt tension when supplies dwindled. Food theft within caravans is mentioned in scattered historical accounts from frontier regions. Trust became fragile under starvation pressure. Caravan leaders sometimes stored reserve rations separately, hidden from general view, not for luxury, but to prevent panic. If everyone believed food was gone, morale could collapse before actual starvation began. And morale was survival. A caravan that lost hope moved slower. A slower caravan consumed more supplies. Food management was not just logistical. It was psychological warfare against despair. Oasis black markets. Oasis cities were not always generous. In times of drought or regional conflict, food prices soared. Merchants arriving desperate for grain might find inflated costs. Black market exchanges happened quietly. Tea bricks, silk scraps, metal goods, all could be traded for emergency grain supplies. Sometimes instant travel rations themselves became trade tools. A pouch of roasted barley flour might be exchanged for fresh dates. Dried dairy curds might be traded for water access. Food was currency when silver was useless. Extreme survival strategies. When things became truly desperate, caravans relied on the land itself. Wild edible plants were gathered cautiously. Small desert animals were hunted when possible. But fuel scarcity limited cooking options. This is where preserved instant meals again proved critical. Even in extreme scarcity, a handful of roasted grain could sustain a person long enough to reach the next water source. It wasn't about satisfaction. It was about extending time. Time to move. Time to reach safety. Time to survive one more day. Climate as the ultimate enemy. The Taklamakan Desert was particularly unforgiving. Its name is often translated loosely as enter and you may not return. Crossing its northern or southern rim required precise timing. If unexpected sandstorms delayed movement, caravans could lose days. And every lost day consumed precious rations. Unlike mountainous terrain where forage might be found, open desert offered almost nothing edible. That is why the 15 instant meals we discussed were not optional luxuries. They were defensive tools against climate. The hierarchy of food value. When scarcity hit, food value shifted dramatically. High-fat dairy curds became extremely valuable in cold conditions. Salted pickles became less desirable if water was low. Sweet sesame clusters might be reserved for the weakest members of the group. Caravan leaders often prioritized guards to maintain protection, camel drivers to maintain mobility, skilled navigators to maintain direction. Food distribution became strategic triage. Survival depended on maintaining function. Lessons in resilience. What's striking is how rarely total collapse occurred on major established routes. Why? Because centuries of experience refined the ration system. Caravans learned from past failures. Routes were adjusted. Supply depots improved. Instant meals were perfected. Trial and error shaped preservation methods over generations. These foods were evolutionary products of repeated risk, the unseen backbone of trade networks. It's easy to romanticize silk flowing westward toward regions once ruled by the Roman Empire. But imagine silk caravans without reliable food. Trade would slow dramatically. Insurance costs would rise, routes would shorten, global exchange would shrink. Instant meals were not glamorous. But they were scalability tools. They allowed trade to stretch farther, last longer, and recover from setbacks. They made the Silk Road sustainable, the quiet reality. Most nights on the Silk Road were not dramatic. They were repetitive, measured, disciplined. A small portion of barley paste, a strip of jerky, a shared bowl of thin noodle broth. Not heroic, not cinematic, just persistent. And persistence builds history more reliably than drama. We've now explored the foods themselves, the daily ration structure, the hierarchy of distribution, the crisis response systems, the psychological dimension of scarcity. So far, we've examined merchants, ration planning, and survival strategies. But the Silk Road was not exclusively a male merchant highway. Families often traveled together, particularly for long-term traders, and their presence reshaped food priorities. Women on the road. Women were active participants in trade caravans. Some were wives of merchants, others were independent traders, and some managed caravan households. Women often carried additional preserved foods tailored for children, nursing, or medicinal purposes. Softened millet or barley cakes for children too young to chew dense flatbreads. Dairy curds or milk powders to supplement nutrition. Pickled vegetables to maintain micronutrient intake during long stretches without fresh produce. Beyond nutrition, women played a central role in food preparation at night. Even in a desert or mountain setting, they ensured that instant meals were properly portioned, hydrated, or softened to improve palatability. This careful management helped maintain morale and survival rates within family-based caravans. Children and travel nutrition. Children traveling along the Silk Road had unique needs. Too much dried meat or jerky could overwhelm developing digestion. Too little carbohydrate energy led to fatigue in extreme heat or cold. Merchants and their families often allocated special portions for children. Softened grains, milder fermented pastes, or small nut and date rolls. Survival depended on balance. Starving a child meant delaying the entire caravan. Providing too much meant consuming resources faster. Every meal was a lesson in rationing, adaptation, and foresight. Medical beliefs and preserved foods. Tang-era Chinese physicians and medical texts emphasized diet as central to health. Dried barley and millet were believed to strengthen the spleen and stomach. Fermented soybean products were thought to promote digestion and balance internal qi. Pickled vegetables were considered preventive against heat stroke or digestive imbalance. Dairy curds were sometimes prescribed for energy recovery during long journeys. Even in extreme environments, merchants followed traditional medical guidance. They combined empirical survival practices with ancient Chinese dietary theory. Food was medicine. Medicine was food. Hygiene and preservation. Preserved foods weren't just about portability. They also minimized risk of illness. Dried meats prevented bacterial growth better than fresh meat. Roasted grains resisted mold. Fermentation and pickling extended nutrient retention while preventing spoilage. Families traveling together had to maintain hygiene, even in cramped camel carts or desert stops. Washing tools and containers was a daily chore. A single contamination could threaten not just one person, but the whole caravan. The role of taste and morale. Even on survival rations, taste mattered. Nut and date rolls provided sweetness and emotional comfort. Tea bricks added warmth and familiarity. Pickled vegetables reminded travelers of home flavors. For children and women, these flavors were critical. Small pleasures reinforced discipline, and cohesion, caravans. Without them, constant hunger and bland monotony could break spirits faster than sandstorms or distance. Social lessons from meals, equality versus hierarchy. Instant meals created survival hierarchies when rationing was needed, but shared meals often reinforced community bonds. Preparation skills. Women and elders ensured rations were usable, safe, and palatable. Discipline and foresight. Children learned early how to respect portions and conserve supplies. Cultural transmission. Recipes, preservation techniques, and knowledge about instant foods were passed down orally across generations. Food became education. Food became culture. Food became survival strategy. By considering families, children, and medical beliefs, we see a fuller picture. The Silk Road wasn't just about merchants, profits, or trade goods. It was about human networks surviving, thriving, and adapting through carefully preserved nutrition. Even with careful planning, not every journey was smooth. The Silk Road was as unforgiving as it was transformative. Extreme conditions demanded creativity, courage, and sometimes desperation. And it is in these moments that the true value of the 15 forgotten instant meals emerges. Extreme survival scenarios. Historical accounts and frontier records reveal several scenarios where rations were all that stood between life and death. Desert sandstorms. Caravans could be stalled for days, buried under wind-driven sand. Food consumption had to be rationed with precision. Emergency famine cakes and powdered bone broth cakes were lifesavers, even if their flavor was harsh and unappealing. Mountain pass delays. High-altitude passes sometimes trapped caravans in snow and ice for days. Dried milk curds and roasted barley flour mixes provided crucial fat and calories to maintain warmth and energy. Oasis shortages. A drying oasis meant not only less water, but also less locally available food. Traders relied heavily on pre-packed dried noodles, roasted chickpeas, and nut date rolls. Sometimes, these foods were traded with local nomads for water access or fresh produce. Bandit raids. When a caravan lost supplies to bandits, rationing protocols shifted immediately. High-calorie, compact foods were prioritized for key personnel, guards, leaders, and experienced navigators, to maintain the caravan's mobility and protection. Every crisis reinforced why portable, preserved foods were central to Silk Road logistics. Rare and forgotten foods. While we've discussed the 15 main instant meals, archaeological evidence and frontier texts hint at additional, now-forgotten foods. Roasted locusts and grasshoppers, occasionally dried and salted for protein during extreme scarcity. Compressed fruit paste, made from apricots or plums, providing both calories and vitamin C to prevent deficiencies. Fermented camel milk bricks, popular among nomadic allies, sometimes adopted by Chinese merchants crossing steppe regions. Salted fish strips, carried near rivers or oasis settlements, less common but highly valued for taste and protein. These were supplemental, emergency, or locally inspired foods, showing the flexibility and adaptation of Silk Road rations. Trade's influence on local cuisine. Instant meals didn't just sustain travelers, they shaped culinary traditions along the route. Roasted barley flour influenced tsampa in Tibetan regions. Dried meat techniques inspired steppe nomadic recipes. Nut date energy rolls evolved into local confectionery traditions. Tea brick trade spread brewing and flavoring methods across Central Asia. In many ways, survival foods became cultural artifacts. They persisted long after their original function as portable sustenance had diminished. Full day in the life. Extreme survival version. Let's reconstruct a day under extreme conditions. Morning. Small spoon of roasted barley flour mixed with minimal water. Tea brick fragment for warmth. Chew a dried milk curd for fat and protein. Midday. Minimal movement. Ration pickled vegetables to maintain electrolytes. Small nut date roll for energy boost. Dried chickpeas or broad beans as emergency protein. Evening. Brief boiling of dried noodles using limited fuel. Powdered bone broth cake added for flavor, warmth, and minerals. Softened millet cakes to fill stomach without excess water usage. Shared flatbread to reinforce community morale. Even in life-threatening circumstances, meals were structured, disciplined, and purposeful. Lessons from extreme conditions. Preparation is everything. Caravans survived not because the Silk Road was safe, but because rations were carefully calculated. Flexibility matters. Instant meals could be modified, combined, or supplemented depending on circumstances. Morale and taste. Even a small piece of sweet sesame or a nut date roll had outsized psychological importance. Distribution reflects hierarchy and function. Guards, navigators, and leaders often receive priority in rationing, a key survival strategy. These lessons transcend time. Modern expedition planners, survivalists, and even long-haul travelers can learn directly from these centuries-old practices, preparing for the unknown. The recurring theme is clear. The Silk Road was unpredictable. Food had to be versatile. Travelers had to be disciplined. Communities had to share resources efficiently. The 15 forgotten instant meals weren't just snacks. They were survival algorithms in edible form. Every recipe, every preserved brick, every dried curd represented centuries of trial, error, and adaptation. So far, we've covered daily routines, survival strategies, and extreme scenarios. Now it's time to examine what remains in the ground, literally, and what we can learn from it. Archaeological evidence of Silk Road meals. Excavations along the Silk Road, especially in western China's Tarim Basin and oasis settlements, have revealed fascinating insights. Dried noodle fragments. Archaeologists discovered wheat-based noodles preserved in arid tombs. Radiocarbon dating places them in the Tang Dynasty, 7th to 10th century. These noodles were thin, long, and dried for portability. Perfect for quick boiling on the road. Roasted barley flour and millet cakes. Storage vessels contain remnants of compressed grain cakes. Their density indicates they were intended for long-term preservation and slow consumption. Dried meat and jerky. Remnants of air-dried salted meats were found in caravan burial sites. Analysis shows careful salting to prevent spoilage without refrigeration. Dairy curds and powdered milk. Remains of dried dairy products were preserved in sealed clay containers, likely used to supplement protein and fat in long journeys. Tea bricks and compressed pastes. Solidified tea blocks were common, used for brewing or chewing. Some contain additives like spices or sugar for caloric and flavor enhancement. These findings confirm that the 15 forgotten instant meals were not myths. They were real, systematic solutions to the challenges of long-distance travel. Nutritional analysis. Based on reconstructed recipes and surviving remnants, scholars estimate calories per day per merchant, approximately 2,500 to 3,000 kilocalories, depending on season and activity. Macronutrient balance. Carbohydrates, approximately 55 to 60% grains, flour, noodles. Protein, approximately 20 to 25% jerky, dairy, legumes. Fat, approximately 15 to 20% dairy, sesame clusters, nuts. Micronutrients, salt, from pickled vegetables and salted meats. Potassium and minerals, from dried fruit and pickled products. Vitamins limited, with occasional supplementation from fresh produce at oasis stops.
Even by modern standards, this was a highly efficient survival diet. Regional variations. The instant meals were not uniform across the Silk Road. Local resources shaped adaptations. Hexi corridor and gansu. More millet and barley-based cakes due to local grain production. Jerky was primarily mutton or goat. Tarim Basin. Incorporation of camel milk curds in northern deserts. Fruit paste from apricots and plums for calories and vitamins. Oasis settlements like Khotan and Kashgar. Integration of Central Asian nuts, dried fruits, and spices. Tea bricks and compressed pastes were heavily traded commodities. These variations reveal that instant meals were flexible, survival-focused but locally inspired. Survival and cultural legacy. These preserved foods were more than functional.
They shaped regional cuisines, for example, noodle traditions, jerky methods, and sesame nut sweets. They influenced social behaviors like ration sharing, family meal routines, and hospitality practices. They provided a foundation for military rations in frontier garrisons. In essence, the 15 forgotten instant meals were the backbone of Silk Road survival, culture, and innovation, reconstructing the complete caravan diet. A full day might look like this. Morning, roasted barley flour mixed with water. Tea brick fragment for warmth. Midday, dried jerky or chickpeas while walking. Pickled vegetables to maintain electrolytes. Evening, boiled dried noodles with bone broth cake. Softened millet cake and sesame sugar cluster for dessert. Dairy curds or nut date rolls as supplemental calories. This schedule maximized calories, preserved hydration, and sustained energy for days or even weeks of travel. The historical takeaway. The 15 forgotten instant meals were more than sustenance. They were logistics solutions, allowing trade to stretch thousands of kilometers. Psychological tools, maintaining morale, culture, and ritual. Nutritional engineering, balancing calories, protein, and micronutrients without refrigeration. Cultural bridges, influencing cuisines, trade practices, and survival knowledge across regions. Without these meals, the Silk Road could not have been the globalizing force it became. After traveling through desert storms, snowed-in passes, and oasis shortages, surviving on rationed millet cakes, dried jerky, tea bricks, and fermented pastes, we arrive at the big picture, the legacy of these meals. Long-term culinary influence. Many of the 15 instant meals left a lasting imprint on regional cuisines across China and Central Asia. Noodles, once dried survival food, now a staple of northern Chinese cuisine. Jerky and dried meats, inspired preserved meat traditions in Xinjiang and Tibet. Sesame and nut sweets, from simple trail energy bites to local confections. Pickled vegetables. Early preservation methods influenced side dishes across desert and steppe regions. Tea bricks, originally transportable caffeine and warmth sources, now part of ceremonial and everyday consumption in Tibetan and Mongolian regions. Survival food became identity, blending utility with culture. Step-by-step recreation of a Silk Road ration for a modern experiment in historical survival. Ingredients: roasted barley flour or coarse millet flour, dried wheat noodles, dried meat strips, beef, lamb, or goat, compressed tea brick fragments, dried milk curds, sesame sugar clusters or nut date rolls, pickled vegetables or dried fruit. Daily schedule. Morning. Mix roasted barley flour with warm water into a thick paste. Brew tea from a small brick fragment. Midday. Consume dried jerky, nuts, or chickpeas while moving. Snack on dried fruit for quick energy. Evening. Boil noodles using minimal fuel, adding powdered bone broth or fermented paste if available. Share softened millet cakes or sesame rolls for morale. Optional dairy curds to supplement fat and protein.
This recreates both the caloric density and the mental discipline required to survive Silk Road travel. Preparation is power. Every meal was planned for distance, climate, and survival. Efficiency matters. Minimal weight, maximal nutrition. Morale is essential. Even small treats reinforce community and resilience. Cultural adaptability. Foods evolved with local environments, beliefs, and resources. Innovation under constraint. Scarcity drove ingenuity that still informs
Modern survival foods. Modern hikers, explorers, and survivalists can learn directly from these ancient practices. Why these 15 forgotten instant meals matter. They were the invisible backbone of the Silk Road, sustaining trade and cultural exchange. They allowed civilizations to connect across thousands of kilometers of harsh terrain. They taught resilience, discipline, and adaptability. They became a legacy of cuisine, preservation techniques, and survival wisdom that endures today. The 15 instant meals were more than food. They were strategy in edible form. Every dried cake, every jerky strip, every tea brick represents centuries of ingenuity. Without them, trade would have faltered, cultures would have been isolated, and the world of interconnected ideas along the Silk Road might never have existed. History remembers empires, wars, and silk. But survival food quietly carried humanity across deserts, mountains, and steppe. The 15 forgotten instant meals of Silk Road merchants are proof that sometimes the most revolutionary inventions are not weapons or gold. They are what you carry in your food sack.